Distinguished guests, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, dear Yossi, dear Uriel, thank you very much for inviting me again to join that meeting here. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here again. Last year, you may remember, I presented you an overview of what we know about how we can use birds as sentinels for environmental changes, in particular climate change, and how climate may affect birds. And we do have already quite a few evidences that these migratory birds are very much affected and their behavior is in change due to climate change issues. Today I would like to focus more on the Mediterranean and the role of the Mediterranean for migratory birds. It's well known, it's just repeat that the Mediterranean is an area where billions of birds pass through in both migratory seasons, in fall as well as in spring. Basically, they are following three routes: a westerly route, a central route, and the easterly route. Then, and this is sometimes a little bit ignored, it's also a place where several hundreds of million birds, northern birds, spend the winter. This is the area they are spending the northern winter. This is the area where they need to survive to be able to breed back at the breeding ranges in the north. Just a few examples from our very recently published Bird Migration Atlas of the Birds of Germany. And this illustrates with one case, that's a blackcap, that these blackcaps are wintering all around the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is their wintering destination. This is the place they spend many, many years in their lifetime. And then three examples of the migratory routes across the Mediterranean. These are the birds which are tropical migrants. They are going from the north to Afro-tropical wintering areas. The one, this one here. The one, this is a garden warbler. It's a typical example for a westerly migrant. So the birds which got banded in Central Europe, in Germany, this is the area they are going to wintering places further down in Africa. Then we have an example of the central migratory route, the Icterine warbler, and the lesser white-throat is a very typical one, which is visiting your area here. So it's the entire Mediterranean we have to have in focus if it comes to a better understanding of the migratory behavior and how we may be able to preserve and conserve these birds at the best we can. And this is a moment I would like to present our recently published Atlas of Bird Migration to Yossi and his library. Thank you very much, Yossi, and appreciate it. Anyhow, these are just a few examples of what we are dealing with. I could bore you for hours with all these examples, but this is not what I would going to aim. This is more important to have in mind. So we know that these birds are going across the Mediterranean or spend the winter in the Mediterranean. But if you have a closer look on what's going on with these birds over the last 25 years, then you can see, if you plot here the population index over the last 25 to 30 years, you can see that the resident ones and the birds which are migrants but are spending the winter within Europe, they are doing quite well. There was a drop in the 80s, but then they are doing quite well. This line here would tell you about a stable population over the 25 years. And as you can see here, they are doing on average quite well. Of course, there are exceptions within these groups as well. But on average, the trans-Saharan migrants, these are the ones which are going across the Mediterranean, are declining dramatically. And we have to ask the question, why do, in particular, these birds decline more so than the other ones? And this is a question we need to address, and the focus is to the Mediterranean. Because these birds are confronted to be able to cross the desert during autumn migration, southbound, or recover after desert crossing, northbound, in spring. And to be able to cope with the desert, these birds need energy. And this is, for example, a garden warbler. It's a live one. This is just to see it from the underside. All that yellowish you can see here is fat. These birds accumulate huge amounts of fat as energy store. This is the fuel for their migratory flights. and basically the energy. But at the same time, it offers the birds water as well, because these birds do not only rely on energy, they rely on available water as well. And there's not much water to drink across the desert. And so by being fed, these birds serve both the energy requirements as well as the water requirements. And these are the basic factors, features these birds need to be so fed as illustrated here. So fattening, fueling, is the major process for these birds. It's a crucial process, and it's illustrated here. This is the same bird just 3 weeks earlier. It's then very lean. You can see just a little bit of that yellowish. This is already a little bit of migratory fat. This is a breast muscle. You can see as a sternum. And so these birds do need to fuel prior to or after crossing the Sahara for successful migration, for subsequent successful breeding. And that fattening, that fueling, happens in particular around the Mediterranean. And this is illustrated here as an outcome of a huge European Science Foundation network I was able to run in the 90s already, where we did the same protocol of trapping and investigating the birds all over Europe in more than 50 different stations. These are a few examples. And these red dots just illustrate the amount of fuel load of these garden warblers on their southbound migration. As you can see here, they do most of their fattening around the Mediterranean. It's a Mediterranean area they rely on. They rely on the proper ecological requirements for successful feeding here in the area during southbound migration as well as during northbound migration. These are the habitats close to the desert where these birds rely on and where these birds fuel their tank. So this is happening, for example, with the garden warbler, and I would just illustrate with that particular case what that means. So this is showing you data from garden warblers we investigated, we studied in northwestern Algeria. Prior to the desert crossing, you can see here, this is a frequency distribution of body masses of these garden warblers. As you can see here, most of them arrived there, these are birds during first trapping, arrived there with something like 20 grams. But this is much too low to be able to cross the desert accordingly. And this is then what's happening in these places. These birds fuel up rapidly. You can see here, this is stopover duration. This is the number of days these birds spend in the area to do their fueling. And these individual lines are connecting retraps of birds. In a couple of days, you can see here that most of them increase body fat, increase body mass dramatically. And this is a huge fueling process, and it's a net gain of at least 10% per day. Think about your own body mass now, and think about in exactly 24 hours from now, you have to weigh at least 10% more than at the moment. So this is what's going on there. This is fueling in the wild. And it's important during spring migration as well. And I would like to illustrate that here with that study we did in southern Morocco. The birds, many of these birds are wintering in Western Africa. The European ones, as illustrated, the Central European ones, they go across the Sahara, and then they rely on these areas here to be able to refuel, to be able to return to the breeding grounds. And nothing was known, almost nothing was known about how well are these birds equipped to continue their migration. And so we did a study there, a pilot study, and we asked the question whether these birds, which we can trap just north of the Sahara, would be able to go at least 600 kilometers to Spain in order to have a proper other feeding ground. So the question is, are these birds here equipped enough to continue, or do they need to refuel? And this is exactly what we did find. So here you can see this is a percentage of birds which would be able, of different species, to go across that 600 kilometers belt without extra feeding. And as you can see here, on average, just 20% would be able to do so. All the others are really relying on that area for refueling to be able to continue successfully to the northern breeding grounds. These birds need habitats. These are the feeding habitats. It's a crucial point. Climate change is an issue. I will come back to that in a minute. But it's habitats. These birds need proper fueling habitats in the Mediterranean, both during autumn migration, southbound, as well as northbound during spring migration. But this is reality in many, many places. This is not snow. This is plastic. Huge areas in southern Spain, for example, are looking like this. This is where we grow crops for us. Cheap crops for us. There are only very, very few trees left. This is not the habitat proper for migratory fueling. But this is reality. And even so, if there's not plastic-covered crop, it looks like this one here. We overuse the area, in particular the Mediterranean, for intensified land use. We use it, the water bodies, for water farming, for aquaculture, and we treat these crops with pesticides and all these issues. So this is why I entitled my talk Hospitality in Danger, because this is exactly what these birds are confronted with. And we can measure that in the longer run as well, and can see the relationship between the availability of habitat, of good habitats, and the bird life. And this could be illustrated by the so-called Normalized Different Vegetation Index. It can be traced by satellite. And so, for example, you can see here there's a coverage of green area in the Maghreb, in the northwestern part of Africa, during spring migration, and it looks rather green here. And this is exactly what these birds are relying on. And I would like to illustrate that with a study, a nice study by Shepp and Murrer on barn swallows. They plotted the arrival of barn swallows at the northern breeding grounds in Denmark against the amount of so-called different normalized different vegetation index, NDVI. And as you can see here, if the stopover conditions are poor down there, they arrive much earlier than if the conditions would be okay. So if the stopover conditions are good, these birds arrive later. So what we are currently discussing a lot is the effect of climate change on arrival dates of migrants, but it could be counteracted by these relationships that are related to habitat quality and nothing else. So we do have quite a number of so-called carryover effects, and we need to have better knowledge of carryover effects, and we need to have a better knowledge about the factors, how they is translated between habitats. So this is exactly what we need to have in mind. We have carryovers, and we need a better understanding of these carryovers. So there is a close relationship between the conditions at the stopover sites and some other life history elements throughout the bird life. But if we take a wider look on the NDVI, then we can see dramatic changes. So this, for example, as I illustrated, is a sketch from a February moment, and this is exemplifying what was happening over the last 20 years in this period here. And as you can see here, many of these red dots here, these spots here. And this is illustrating habitat loss. So there's a huge habitat loss all around the Mediterranean. It's just illustrated, exemplified for this Maghreb area. This habitat loss is basically due to agriculture and human use in general. It's not that much related to climate change. Most is driven by human use, how we make use of the environment. But, of course, there is a climate change on top as well. Many of the places around the Mediterranean are looking like this one here, and this is due to overgrazing by, for example, goats and other animals. So this is a habitat which is not suited to serve the needs for our migratory birds. Therefore, we have to find a way to act on these changes. So this is the reality. But as I mentioned, on top is climate change, and this is basically, in some places, less rain as compared to the past. Or if there is rain, it's a heavy rainstorms, more frequent heavy rainstorms, huge floods, but then the water disappears quickly. And in a few places we have later rains, which are too late to serve the environment, to serve the vegetation, to be then available for the migrant, let me say easily. So we do have climate change on top, but first of all, it's an habitat issue we should have in mind. But nevertheless, the climate change needs to be addressed, and this should be illustrated again with an example from the Maghreb, from the Western Maghreb. They can see here the precipitation anomalies over the last 100 years for that area in 3 different regions. The Saharan region, south of the Atlas Mountains, the Atlantic region, and the Mediterranean regions. So these are basically the 2 regions where these birds are relying on to do proper fueling, either in fall or during spring migration. And as you can see here, in particular, these areas here are, over the last 20 years, suffering from less rain. So there is a dramatic change going on. And if you can see here, it's basically the split here around the 80s, the early 80s. And this corresponds nicely, unfortunately very nicely, with what we know about the population changes of migratory birds. Again, exemplified here with another data set from the Danish counts. And you can see here again that the non-trans-Saharan migrants are doing quite well, the resident birds as well as the European migrants. But if it comes to the trans-Saharan migrants, they are in the dramatic decline, and this matches, corresponds very nicely what was going on, or what is going on in the northern Maghreb, in northwestern Africa. So, so-called desertification is an issue we need to focus on. We did so in the past very much for the wintering grounds. But it's even more so if you have a closer look during stopover. If it comes to wintering grounds, we meanwhile know that these birds do have some flexibility there. They may follow the rains. They may winter a little bit further south. But if it comes to stopover, they really rely precisely on the area here. And these are the areas which are under risk to change very rapidly over the next couple of years. And of course, we need to consider and to think about that still illegal killing of birds going on in the Mediterranean. And it has been recently summarized in a booklet published a couple of weeks ago by BirdLife International. So still, illegal killing on top of the habitat changes is an issue we need to address very precisely and very carefully. And it's particularly pinpointed by the situation we are currently experiencing along the Egyptian coast. There is a continuous net line running from east to west of something like 700 kilometers of nets. It has been recently discovered by a TV team from Germany that the entire coast, in particular during autumn migration, is covered. This is the Mediterranean Sea, is covered by these nets, and there's an estimate that something like 140 million birds each year are killed in these particular places. This is a huge number. It's an issue we need to address very precisely, and we need immediate action, no doubt about that. But we need to identify which populations are affected by that illegal killing, illegal taking, and we need to identify the black spots. And that could be very different. If you see, for example, there are 2 examples of our German analysis. These are the common buzzard and the song thrush. As you can see here, it's not just only the Mediterranean. So for the song thrush, yes, these are the hot spots, or let me say the black spots of illegal killing for the song thrush. But if it comes to the common buzzard, it's even further north. So we should not only focus on the Mediterranean, also it's a very important place for that issue, but it's important to identify where we need to have actions. Otherwise, we may fail with proper activities in the future. And we need to have a closer look on the causes of mortality of these migrants on the way. And again, we can use recovery of ringed birds, where we get information about the causes of mortality. And so you can see here, in comparison of Central Europe situation and the Southern Europe situation before 1980 and after 1980, that break is because in the early 1980s, the European Birds Directive was introduced, hoping to change the situation for the birds. And you can see here, yes, if it comes to the song thrush, for example, taking was still an issue in the past in Central Europe. It disappeared more or less, but it's still a huge issue in the southern part of Europe, basically means the Mediterranean. So not much was changed due to the initiation of the Birds Directive. If it comes to the raptors, the situation is different. Yes, hunting decreased, but at the same time, birds which collide are increasing. So we have a change in the spatial and temporal organization, let me say, of the cause of mortality, and this needs to be traced to be able to do proper actions for the conservation of migratory birds. And so if it comes to the recent situation, we need to address issues of wind turbines, we need to address the issue of electrocution, which is a huge issue, particularly around the Mediterranean, and as you can see here, that proportion here increased dramatically if it comes to the death of migratory birds. So if it comes to the conservation of migratory birds, we should have in mind that they spend only 3 to 4 months at the northern breeding grounds. So if you are aiming to understand these declines, of course, it's important to address issues at the breeding grounds, because these are the areas of reproduction. But most of the year, these birds are on migration or at the wintering ground. They spend most of their time at the non-breeding grounds, and therefore we need what I like to call a tripod conservation strategy. It's not just the breeding area we need to focus on, it's stopover and it's wintering. And therefore we are now back to our question regarding the Mediterranean, because the Mediterranean is an important stopover place for migrants to be able to migrate successfully, and it's a wintering place as well. So we need to address the conservation of migratory species in an annual cycle approach, understanding how these various issues are linked together, what is the connectivity, what is the carryover. And this is exactly what we need to address in the future. We need a much better understanding of connectivity in terms of connectivity between sites, for example, breeding, stopover, and wintering sites, but as well if it comes to a temporal scale, and we need a better understanding of connectivity, and this is related to what I tried to explain a little bit with so-called carryover. So these are the features we are confronted for the future, and we need to do immediate actions. And we can do so. So for example, we do have these ring recoveries. I just presented that new atlas we produced, and this is an example of a data set I was able to get from the SPNI, where you can see here, these are the recoveries of birds ringed in Israel and found elsewhere, or ringed abroad and trapped in Israel just in 1 year, in 2013. So we do have these data sets where we can already use, or we can use already existing information to extract information about connectivity. It's there, we have to use it. And so I dream that the Israeli data will end up in a bird migration atlas soon as well, to show us connectivity between our countries and between various countries. You can see, for example, that quite a few of these birds are which are migrating through the Middle East here to Israel, are of more easterly origin, and so we need to pinpoint exactly where these birds are coming from, where they are going to address proper conservation questions. And of course, we have these new tools of tracking technology, and this is exactly what we should intensify in our use. And there are a few examples in the past. Of course, it's always a famous white stork. We are very, very familiar with the white stork, but we can do it in many other cases as well, and this, for example, is illustrating an early case of great white pelican tracked, and so we can do it on different scales, but we have to do it more intensified. We have to do it with proper questions behind, not just an anecdotic collection. And so we can illustrate and get information in a rather short time, and this should be illustrated by the Montagu harrier. The migration system of the northern Montagu harrier was almost unknown, and therefore we started then a huge satellite tracking project, and within a couple of years, less than 10 years, we were able to show exactly what is going on, and by that we can translate that in conservation measures. So, for example, we are able to identify the wintering areas of these different populations. As you can see here, there's quite some connectivity. Most of the northwestern European birds are going to a very western African wintering area, A few are going to a more easterly one, and the Polish one, for example, are far more eastern. There's not much overlap. This is connectivity. This is what we need to know if it comes to conservation of migratory birds. And we can use this kind of data to identify the important stopover areas. This is exemplified here for the western Montagu Harrier migratory routes. And so it was unknown that these harriers are relying on stopover in the Maghreb. Again, both during autumn as well as spring migration. But it's not just describing migratory routes and identifying wintering and stopover areas. We need to have a closer look regarding the functionality. Why do these birds stop over there? Why do these birds winter in this place and not the other place? And so we need to have a closer look on what's going on. And so, for example, we got that kind of data where we can see that Montagu Harrier, south of the Sahara, spent the first half of their winter in September, October, rather north, and then they move further south. There's more or less midwinter movement, and we have to ask why that's the case. And this is what we need to do. We have to link our tracking data, which are fascinating, of course, but we have to link it to the ecology. We need to do so-called ground truthing. This means we have to understand why this is so linked as it is. And so it came out in that particular study we published recently that they are following a very particular local locus, not the migratory locus, but a local locus, and that local locus is moving with the range, and therefore the birds are moving with the prey, the birds are moving with the range. And so this is exactly what we need to do in the future, not just describing routes, but asking functionality relationships, and so to be able to identify the requirements for survival, for migration, and of course for subsequent breeding, and this is what we call carryover. Otherwise, we will not be able to understand properly the migratory cycle of such a bird, and we will not be able to do proper, sustainable conservation. We need to do so by in situ studies. We have to go to the places and to understand that ground truthing on the site, but we do have these many remote data available as well, and this is not fully explored yet, and we need to link our tracking data, our connectivity data by tracking to remote data to be able to explain the patterns we see. Of course, we need to stop, and we have to do all to stop illegal killing, in particular in the Mediterranean. This is an issue, it's a very emotional issue, it's very important, but again, habitats are much more important. We need to preserve or to restore habitats, otherwise we will not really help these birds. And by that, I guess, we need to introduce a new methodology, let me say, and this is so-called environmental stewardship programs. And these are aiming that habitat and landscape management are designed to deliver significant environmental benefits. If we should fail to work together with the land users as well as with the land protectors, let me say, we will fail. At the final end, economy will dictate, but we can find a way of a win-win strategy if we adopt environmental stewardship programs. I guess this is the most important challenge for everywhere on the globe, but in particular for the Mediterranean. So what we do need to conserve migratory species is a cross-border concerted action, or not just one, many of them. And fortunately, since last November, we are in a situation that we do have now a global instrument because the Convention on Migratory Species, the Convention of the Conference of the Parties of the Convention of the Migratory Species last year in Ecuador adopted our proposal to install an action plan for migratory land birds in the African Eurasian region. So this is now the frame we have, but we have to do action on that. And it's covering the entire range. 128 range states signed already and are participating in that initiative. Now we do have the instrument. We can cover Africa, Europe, Middle East, and Central Asia. This is the range. So the instrument is there, but it's to us now to act on that. We do have the instrument, it's but to us. For the sake of our birds and for the sake of our own environment. By that, thank you very much.